I just wanted to welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us this afternoon here in Chicago, and it's evening in Tekoa and Bethlehem. And we have what I'm sure will be another powerful program for you this afternoon with Roots Shorashim. So just to quickly read description organization from the website, that they're an organization fostering a grassroots movement of understanding, nonviolence, and transformation among Israelis and Palestinians, and envisioning a social and political reality that is founded on dignity, trust, and a mutual recognition and respect for both peoples' historic belonging to the entire land. A very intriguing vision. And so this is not our first program, but we had Rabbi Shaul Judelman and Noor Awad with us over the summer and began really a fascinating dialogue. It's so wonderful to have you both with us. And I received very many comments last time from participants who just found it so, the whole program to be really interesting and moving. And I think we all felt that your dialogue between the two of you was very, very real and coming from a place of truth. Maybe all in terms of presenting your own narrative to each other and also being open with each other's narrative. So Rabbi Shaul Judelman, for those of you who weren't here last time, a co-founder of Roots, and as I mentioned last time, a longtime friend of my wife Rachel and mine, one of the only people we knew independently before we met. I met Shaul as an environmental activist in Kathmandu, Nepal. He's now talking to us from Tekoa settlement in Gush Etzion. And Noor Awad moved from a refugee camp in Jordan to Beit Sahur in the West Bank during the Oslo Accords. He's an activist and a licensed tour guide who gives geopolitical tours in Bethlehem. He has been working with Roots since 2016. And I think many of us found his testimony and your testimony to be striking and powerful about your journey to get to where you are. So I'd like to encourage all of you after the program to go to their website to see their very interesting shared values. There are many of them. I just want to quote a few of them to you. The recognition and the support of each other's identity on all its levels, individual and collective national self-criticism, equality of civil, political, and national rights for Palestinians and Israelis, working within a broken reality without accepting it. For the subject of this afternoon's talk, we asked Shaul and Noor to take on a question that may be really at the heart of this problem facing all of us who have stakes in the conflict and who are hoping and praying for peace. And that is peace building from within national identities. Two strong national identities, two peoples with historic connections to the land, a very small piece of land, religious identities, scars from the conflict. How do you make it work? So thank you for bringing this topic to us. I'm going to apologize in advance to everyone because I'm going to leave in a few minutes to my son's birthday, but I wanted to be there to say hi and introduce today's program. And we have our education director, David Schwartz, who will be leading the Q&A at the end of the program. So thank you very much for joining us, Shaul and Noor. It's all yours. You're on mute, by the way.
Thank you, Adir. And it's really great to be back in the community. Always good to see you, an old friend and a dear friend. And also, I really remember fondly we had a nice conversation this summer, this August. I see some of the faces. I remember the names from these little Zoom capsules. But I'm so excited to pick up where we left off in a sense. And a little bit of questioning for myself, just in running the presentation, like what to go back over in terms of what we said before. You know, it was a few months ago already, and I think in our last presentation, both Noor and I spent a fair amount of time telling a bit of a personal story. But I always say even when a group comes to us for a one-off session in sharing that personal story, it's not because Shaul's story is important or Noor's story is important. That's not what's going to change the conflict, but what is important in our story, what is important, every person's important. Let's also make that clear. But each one of our stories connects deeply to how we fit into these collective identities. that are really at stake in the conflict. If it's national identities, religious identities, political identities, and the question of whether Shaul and Noor get along, type A, type B personalities is really relevant to the conflict, because the conflict's not between us; it's between who we are and the things that we see ourselves a part of. And so just to place us, so my name is Shaul Judelman. I'm 43, or 42 perhaps. I live in Tekoa, with, like Adir said, is a settlement, it's a Jewish community in the West Bank, just outside of Bethlehem. Tekoa is a really incredible place. It's mentioned in the Bible as the town where Amos the prophet is from, who obviously for a long time has been calling out society and seeking a better future. I'm here in this part of the land, which is part of a longer story like I told last time, but there's something for me very vital in what it means to be a Jew and to see the level of Jewish life being recreated here. I don't think I moved out to Gush Etzion as a part of a political statement. I moved it as a part of, as a way of connecting back to our people's history, my own family's name. I always say my dad's name is Yehuda, Judah. My grandfather's name is Yehuda. My great grandfather's name is Yehuda. These are the mountains of Judah. I grew up near the Cascade Mountains, which are beautiful, but they didn't carry my name. And these are the actual mountains of the world that carry my name. And I want to use that, just that little tidbit. I think anybody's gone to a Jewish wedding. We should all be blessed to go to many more. Od Yeshama Ba'arei Yehuda, again will be heard in the cities of Judea, the sound of the bride and the groom singing and dancing. There's something very powerful in that connection that our people and our Jewish story has back to this place. And so one of the reasons I moved to Tekoa was really because of the community that was created here in Tekoa, which was really centered. People always ask, the settlements, why live in a settlement? At the core of each community, I think, are the people and the teachers, the people, the founders who founded the community, and especially here in Gush Etzion, I found just an incredible kind of a renaissance of Jewish life here, extant from the conflict in a certain way, not about facts on the ground or political things or territorial demands, but really just an incredible expression of Jewish life in a way that's challenging a lot of the ways that people are stuck. My communities are both a religious and secular community. We live together. We have one school. We have one swimming pool. The community was founded in 1976 by religious and secular Israelis who felt that was an important issue to work on. And what's that got connected? Because there's a deep sense of the Jewish story coming alive in this land, and actually was a fair amount of Jews in the Soviet Union that had fled in the 70s, gotten out, and the Jewish agency placed them in Rehovot, I think, in the center near Tel Aviv, and these young immigrants, Olim Chadashim from the Soviet Union, says, we didn't come, they're Zionists. We didn't come to live in some urban sprawl. We came here to build a country. We want to go build a town, and they came out here, and so there's a very deep sense, even the secular Jews in this town and the religious Jews town, every one of them has their deep sense of what it means to be here in some level. And that's a very powerful bond between people. And I think it's one of the bonds that helps us get across the questions about Sabbath observance or whether you drive or not, or how the schools, there is something that bonds us together. And it's something very, very, of course, hard to put on. What is the Jewish glue that connects me, the ultra-Orthodox Jew in there, and the Ethiopian Jew that just is still in Ethiopia, and then the South African Jew, and the Jew in Evanston, Chicago, and the Jew. What is it that keeps us together when maybe our cuisines and our religious observance and all kinds of things might be completely different, but there's some ineffable kind of thing that holds us together, and on this, if I put the classic kind of paradigm between religious or national story. For me, growing up, the lead Jewish song was Am Yisrael Chai, was the Jewish people live. It wasn't a religious claim. It was got to do with as a young kid for me, the Jews in the Soviet Union seeking freedom, the Jews in Ethiopia facing the famine, the Jews in Israel, the Jews in here. That story and that identity is a very powerful source of meaning, source of being, and of course, all these beautiful things. I think anybody who's many Jews have stepped off a plane, project everyone, but many Jews have stepped off of a plane at Ben Gurion onto the tarmac and started walking on this land and felt some sense of something, of something being a part of this again. That's an incredible thing we have, an incredible riches that we have to be part of this people. And on the other hand, if we take that to its full expression and say the four-letter word that it comes out as, national identity? Are you talking about nationalism? Didn't we learn that nationalism was one of the greatest evils that wrought pain and havoc and murder and violence across human society in the last century? Have we not learned anything? Are we filling our kids with nationalist sentiment? Is that what it means to send them to Hebrew school? To sing that song, Am Yisrael Chai? And here we come into a bit of a crisis that the Jewish people are facing. Especially as a lot of the world seeks to go forward and pursue those values that we've learned from the painful moments of the past, of all this war and national conflict, and to seek a peace. And there became a humanistic vision of the world where national identities need to find their place and not be the end all be all. And this question of survival, which on the one hand is such a remnant of the Jewish story in our time. At the other hand, isn't it just programming us for conflict? And here we come a little bit approaching the conflict, and how do we resolve this conflict? And many people would say if a deep part of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is based on these intense national identities, then in order to solve the conflict, we're going to have to step away from those identities. We're going to have to create a different identity, maybe a humanistic identity. And maybe that question of humanity can maybe be the place where we all meet in all these conflicts across the world and recognizing each other's humanity. And there's of course, in the last 100 years, I think particularly after the Second World War with the United Nations and this vision of a world that's not based on these national identities, but on a simple common human identity. And one of the special so one of the neat things I've gotten to do in the last actually 6 months since we started talking was join a kind of a think tank with a group of different Israeli peace activists who are and the professors who found it's at the Van Leer, which is kind of a center of academic kind of intellectual work and social work in Jerusalem, the Van Leer Institute. And the two professors are seeking a non-liberal vision of peace. Can we expand the vision of peacemaking beyond the liberal tenets on which it's largely set? And the professor, Erica Weiss, actually she sits on the academic council of Roots. In the opening session, she said, if you go back to the text of the Oslo Accords and you listen to Clinton's speeches and then the way that people were talking, and you go back to that early 90s sense of what was going on in the world, around the world with the fall of the Berlin Wall and the Cold War coming to an end, and the end of apartheid in South Africa, and here in the Middle East also a tremendous breakthrough between the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and she said when you go back and read the texts of the Oslo Accord, she says it's almost piece for piece what the exact words and tenets of classic liberal humanism were speaking, and which sounds wonderful. And there's a sense of the end of history then, right? Of we've overcome the Cold War, and there's some environmental movement was picking up. A sense of common humanity was really clearly the new way forward, and that was the high of peace. The sense of it's a matter of the arc of history bending towards justice, and it's we're getting past these things in New Middle East. And lo and behold, the Oslo Peace Accords today, the peace process that was hoped for and was sought to bring in usher of a new era, is nowhere to be found. Nowhere to be found, except for in textbooks and political pontificate, and put it crassly a little bit, but the political pontifications. One of the most important things I think we do at Roots is speaking with a lot of young Israelis and Palestinians. And I almost ask all of them who come into our center, is there a peace process? Is the reality that you live in, would you say there's a peace process? And it's almost impossible to find a hand that goes up. And so the reason this in a sense, why Roots evolved. Why is Roots a peace initiative? Why did we come about? There was the peace initiative in the 90s. It was a political peace plan. It was signed to by the parties. And one of the reasons why it clearly didn't pass was because of the settlement movement. But what does a settlement movement mean? What are the settlements? Is it we just physically can't move those people out of their houses? Why not? If we pay them enough, they should go. What is this adamant holding on to by land to land and what some people would say there's a case of people of defining their identity by land, these hills of Judea and the hills of Samaria. There's this, in a sense, almost my rabbi would call it a primitive. Primitive people define themselves by where they live. That's primitive. That's anachronistic. We're here in the 21st century. And there's something very true that national identities are passé in some ways. But here, I think also definitely in the United States and across the world, we see this kind of the liberalist humanist vision of how history is supposed to play forth, knocking up against very adamant progenitors of identity, people who feel threatened by those words, feel fear of losing their identity, and are digging in and are claiming their stake on their land, on their homeland, and some very intense, obviously, phrases that echo some of the worst elements of fascism and violence in the last century. And but there became a sense, I think, also kind of reflecting in the my own reflections, looking back on the Palestinian national project. People tell me a lot that in the 80s there was a much greater secular presence in this land, in the Palestinian society. You know, you look at pictures in the first Intifada and you see Palestinian women without head coverings and out on the streets. And maybe perhaps on the other side too, starting with the Iranian Revolution. I'm not sure when, but you know, there's this resurgence of nationalist thinking, of a religious identity, of people choosing to find themselves in those old stories. This obviously resonates strongly for me. I'm a person who grew up secular and decided to become religious, who grew up in the diaspora and decided to move to Israel. But there's something very powerful in what I observe myself, what I gain from those communities and those identities and those stories that become a real part of my life. But does that mean that I can't make peace? Does that mean that that there's no way to peace? And if there's a resurgence of those national identities, is the case of peace doomed? In a sense, that's one of the questions that Roots is struck out to seek an answer to. And I'll quote here, and something one of my Palestinian co-founders, Ali Abu Awad, said, and try to hear this in the context of this Israeli-Palestinian conflict of settlements and refugees and Palestinian refugees. And he said, the Oslo Accords asked both peoples to give up on their identities. And people can't do that. He says, instead of asking us to change our behaviors, if I state that being in this part of the land in the West Bank is something very critical and vital to something very critical and real and to my national story, is that the obstacle to peace, or is it the behavior of how we behave when we're here? Do we behave as a military occupation? Do we, you know, in the way that identity being expressed by life is being lived out? And one of the questions one of the, I think, movements we're trying to move in our society is to focus on that, to acknowledge those identities, to say, instead of threatening those identities and watching them bite us back, we need to invite those identities to the table. It was a very frightening thing that a lot of Israelis point to when they hear the Palestinians chanting, "From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free." Now, a lot of it, of course, you can definitely hear that, and maybe for some people, the intent really, and I think the larger intent is that we're going to reclaim our land, and it's from the river to the sea. In much the same way that Jewish people on the Israeli right see the greater land of Israel includes the entire land. So for a long time, that chant terrified me. I mean, there's no hope for peace. But now I hear that chant, and I hear the call of a people who define this land as Palestine, who see it as their homeland, and I started to understand it through my own story. Right, some of the most frightening when Palestinian, I think recently there's a big outrage that in Palestinian textbooks, Jaffa and Haifa are listed as Palestinian cities. And I understand, of course, there's definitely the problem with not recognizing another's identity. But I think that identity is so real and so visceral that it can't be put in a box and shipped away and told that it's unkosher. It has to be allowed to be seen. It has to be allowed to be heard. It has to gain respect from the other side and recognition from the other side. And kind of puzzling through this kind of line of questioning of thinking of what does it mean to address those issues and not shy away from them, has been kind of I think a real subtext that's developed through Roots and through the Roots activist people in really inside the initiative is looking. So I want to say that for me, as opposed to finding a place where the Israelis will be a little less Israeli, the Palestinians will be a little less Palestinian. For me, the challenge now is, can my Zionism, my belief in my people's belonging and our people's belonging and return to this land and desire to create here a future, and can that contain, or can that come to terms with and see as partners in this land of Palestinianism? And I'll say in a Palestinianism that doesn't not a Palestinian on the Palestinian territories and the 67 borders and the West Bank and a little sliver of Gaza, which is less than 25% of 22% of this original Palestine. Can I see this land as Palestine and acknowledge that? And of course, we'll get to borders or we'll get to political solutions, but can I see that national identity as it is? And I want to pass over to Noor. I want to share one story just to kind of what this meant to me, a moment where this kind of really hit me. I'm quite used to driving around the hills here around Jerusalem and feeling a palpable sense of history of being in the land of where it all began, and envisioning our ancestors here, and that the hills are alive, with the sound of Jews, of our story. It's a very palpable feeling, and it's something very easy to imagine. And everywhere you go here, there's those archaeological remnants. And one day at Roots, we had a workshop during the summer, and the workshop was located in a kibbutz Suba, in a kibbutz just west of Jerusalem. And to get to the workshop, our Palestinian partners had to go through a security checkpoint to go over the green line. And afterwards, I think I met Noor and Jamal and Khalid and Cameron Wells was in the car. And we took off driving from the Bethlehem checkpoint through Jerusalem towards Kibbutz Suba. And Noor, whose family is from Malcha, which is the southwest suburb of Jerusalem, on the highway, we passed by Malcha. And I couldn't but not think of what it means to Noor in the backseat of the car, looking at the neighborhood that was his grandparents' village, right there. And then we drove down the road past Ein Karm, past the Hadassah Hospital there, and through the neighborhood of Ein Karm, which of course was a Palestinian town until 1948. That was evacuated through the war, depopulated, and then became a Jewish community there. And then and driving through the road from Ein Karm to the Castle, I heard in the back seat, Jamal and Khalid and Noor talking about, this is the road, speaking in Arabic, but talking about what these places were and what the Arab names of those same towns and this road up to the Castle, which is obviously a critical battle in the 48 war. And I saw Palestine. The landscape in front of me was Palestine. Of course it was. It was Palestine. It was an incredible moment. And as much as my story is true and our story is true, it was this place of this land is Palestine, and in the same way that I felt a very, I guess, a transformative experience in there, and it was something that showed me a deep place. I think a sense of where we need to be able to get to seek to strive for, and vice versa in each ways. But that, for a bit of me, that's become kind of this pathos of the title of this talk, of peace building from within national identities, of what it means to stand in these places, which are, in a sense, are paradoxical. They're contradictory. They're normally seen as they are mutually exclusive, and wonder, can we get there? What would it take to bring that level of reconciliation between these identities together in this conflict? So I'm going to pass on to Noor to also share Noor's and, and learn something here. And then, of course, we'll come back together for continued conversation with the congregation. Thanks.
Thank you, Shaul. These are very powerful words, and everything Shaul says, because I know Shaul and we talk to groups a lot and we work together. Like, I know where it comes from, like everything that he is talking about, and the ideas that he's trying to turn it into words and get it outside. Okay, my name is Noor. I will tell you a little bit about my personal story and what I think about the work of Roots, what we are doing at Roots. So I was born in Amman, Jordan, 1991, but I usually say that my story began 42 years before I was born. And I say that because I want to go back to 1948. And 1948, the things that happened in 1948 shaped my life. I believe that it shaped my life, and it affected all of my family and several generations. So in 1948, my family, my entire family, and my grandparents, they used to live in a village southwest of Jerusalem, and my family lived there for a long time, for centuries, until the war of 1948 started, and they found themselves forced to leave their village to a refugee camp in the area of Bethlehem. That's where my grandparents ended up. But I know from their story that they wanted to go back. They hoped that this will be for a few days or weeks, and they would go back to their village. However, with the last ceasefire agreement, they end up actually not being able to go back to Malha, because when the ceasefire line was established, Malha became on the Israeli side of the ceasefire line, and they are in Bethlehem, which became under the control of Jordan, or under the occupation of Jordan after 1949. My grandparents lived in Bethlehem since then. My grandfather rented a house here in Bethlehem. And actually, until this day, my parents are still living in the same house that my grandfather rented in 1951. My father was born here in Bethlehem, and my mother as well. After 1967, they both grew up under the Israeli occupation. And my father, he studied, and then he worked in several things. My mother actually studied in Jerusalem, and she became a nurse. And during the first Intifada, the first Palestinian uprising, my mother was a nurse at Al-Maqasid Hospital in East Jerusalem. And that was a tough time. So I can say that my parents, both of them, at some point, they decided to leave to Jordan, seeking a new life, seeking a better future, going far away from Palestine and from the conflict and from the occupation. That's what my parents tried to do. And that's why I was born in Amman, Jordan. By 1995, the Oslo peace process was going on. And for the first time in their lives, in my parents' lives, it's something else. It's something different. Now they are talking about peace. They are talking about the hope of peace and the hope of ending the occupation and statehood. And soon there will be a Palestinian state in Gaza and in the West Bank. And that hope brought my parents back, because they knew they are not going to stay in Jordan forever. And that's why they came back here to live in Bethlehem. And let me tell you that when I came to live here, I was very young, 4 years old, 5 years old. I don't remember that much of the conflict. I don't remember that much of the occupation. Most of my childhood memories was about my father working in Jerusalem. We go on the weekends. We go for trips. We go to the beach, to Jaffa, Tel Aviv. We travel, and that's what I mostly remember. I don't mean, or I'm not saying that the conflict disappeared or it didn't exist. The occupation wasn't there, but I was very young to understand the complexity of the situation that I live in now. But I grew up, and the peace process came to fail, and actually it failed to establish a Palestinian state or create peace between Israelis and Palestinians. And it ended up with more frustration and violence on the ground. That led to the second uprising, the second Palestinian intifada. And I grew up during the second intifada when I saw many things. My life became abnormal. My father lost his job in Jerusalem. He had no work after that. We struggled like many families here. And there was no schools to go to at some point. And my family, like some of my cousins and distant cousins, were like involved in the intifada. Some were killed, others were arrested. So I lived and I experienced the intifada, and I start to think about myself and my future, where I'm going. And I felt easily frustrated from the situation and unlucky that my parents brought me here and I have to live this conflict. And I felt that I should run away. If I want to enjoy my life, if I want to have a better future, then I should run away from it. That's what I said to myself. On the other hand, I didn't actually run away. I mean, I had another way of thinking about it. I was asking all the time about what's my responsibility. And for me, that's also the same time when I grew up, and I thought more about my national identity and how important it is, my national identity. Shaul is a bit older than me, and he spoke about the 90s, and he spoke about, you know, this new way forward and this common humanity that affected the world. And after the fall of the end of the Cold War and the fall of the Soviet Union, and how the world basically changes, and people talking about common humanity. But like for me, a Palestinian growing up in the West Bank under the effect of the conflict and the occupation and the restrictions on my movement, I still feel that nationality is a very important thing for me, because it's like I feel that a huge part about this conflict is trying to erase my national identity and my connection to this land. And they are not two separate things. Like my national identity and my connection and history on this land is one thing for me and for us. It's the same thing here for my people. So our physical removal from the land is connected to our national identity, and therefore, like any attack on our national identity feels similar to us to remove us physically from the land. And that's why I care more about my national identity and my heritage and who I am. And also what I'm trying to say is that growing up under these circumstances, under the occupation and under restrictions, it's nice to think that we are all we're all human beings. But I look and I have a Palestinian passport, which is not actually a passport that represents a state. There is no state of Palestine. It's a traveling document from the Palestinian Authority based on the Oslo Accords. And wherever I go, even if I go to Jordan or Lebanon, if I never went to Lebanon, but even if I go there, the authorities will treat me not as a human being and not as a fellow Arab or a Palestinian. They will treat me according to my passport, according to my document that I have, that I hold. And that affects a lot, like psychologically, I would say for many of us, for many Palestinians, that's a big factor. I actually usually say that it's easier for me if I want to travel abroad to get a visa to Europe maybe than getting a visa to Dubai or to Lebanon. So I just wanted to say that I grew up with many reasons for why national identity is a extremely important thing in my life. And it brings with it at the same time the misery. It brings with it the suffering. But for me, it was about the awareness as well. the awareness about what's happening to me and what's happening to us collectively. I thought that I have a responsibility, we have a responsibility as this generation, on my side, on my people's side, that Palestinians have to stand up and we have to resist this occupation. And our national identity makes us stronger to do this resistance against the occupation, to stand all together and to stand against this occupation. And I usually say that with the resistance comes like violence, and I saw violent ways of resistance and non-violent ways as well. But the most important thing is not the violence or the non-violence. It's about how do I relate to the other side? How do I relate to their identity, the legitimacy of their existence here, who they are, what they are doing on our land, what they are doing on our soil. And it wasn't easy for me, and it wasn't possible actually to see the others as humans, as human beings with legitimate identity. I saw them as settlers, as foreigners, as aliens coming to our lands. By 2016, I made my way to Roots. I found about Roots when I was guiding one of an American group, American students group who were here on a trip to Israel and Palestine to learn about the situation. And this is how I found about Roots. The first time I heard about Roots, I was suspicious, and I actually start to question, like, what are the real intentions of such a initiative? Are the settlers trying to legitimize their cause by doing this? What's happening there? What is Roots? I had many questions in my mind. I went there. I met Rav Hanan, who's one of the co-founders of Roots, and I listened to him that day. I've met Israelis before, and I listened to them in the context of a tour guide bringing my groups to a speaker. And I mostly hear denial from these Israeli speakers when it comes to talk about Palestinian identity, when it comes to talk about even the reality today about the occupation, for example. I mostly hear denial, but for the first time, I met an Israeli who was talking with empathy, with a lot of empathy to my side, and recognition, with a lot of recognition. Not leaving his identity, not giving up on it, but at the same time recognizing my side of the truth or my identity, which would seem at first contradicting. How could that a settler talking about the importance of living in Judea and Samaria and the legitimacy of doing such act, at the same time recognizing the occupation and talks about the occupation and against the occupation? How could it that a Zionist who achieved or fulfilled his most important dream to come back to the land of Israel and live here in the land of Israel, but also talks about the Nakba, the catastrophe of 1948. I hear those things from Rav Hanan that day that challenged me and made me confused about what he's talking about. But actually, I wasn't confused. As I said, I felt this empathy and recognition by listening to him and understanding what Roots is about. Shaul said something about the work of Roots and about how important is it to that Roots is bringing the both people's identities on the table, and that moment of realization that this is also the other people's land, and that their identity is also true. And this moment of realization that this is Palestine, and the moment of realization that this is the land of Israel. I had this moment as well. I feel that I had it several times. It wasn't easy, but because of this work that we do and because of the process that we went through so far, we were able to see the truth on the other side. at the end, I would say that I believe in the concept of roots. I heard about peace organizations before. I heard what they are saying. I never felt actually they are really talking about peace as much as they are talking about a truce, a ceasefire. That's how mostly it sounded to me. That's how it felt. Shaul talked about this idea of recognition, of recognizing that we are from here, that we belong to here, to this land, and that's very important. And that was very missing when I heard about organizations or initiatives or groups of Israelis and Palestinians who are talking about peace or working for peace. I've touched that and I feel that at roots. And our name is Roots. We believe that what we have today, borders, Jerusalem, refugees, settlements, occupation, terrorism, violence, all of these are symptoms of the root conflict. And the root cause of the conflict is our identities. The solution, as Shaul said, not to give up on these identities, but to practice it in a way that does not deny the other side or blind us from the other side. So yeah, that's the idea of roots, and that's the concept of reconciliation and peace that we are working for.
David, I'm happy to open up to questions. The other things, maybe one thing we didn't touch on so much yet was about religion, about religion's place and kind of what a lot of definitely is going on at Roots work. And if we're talking about that respect or this, and I want to posit something here. In one version of peacemaking, it's incumbent until we see each other as the same, we can't really make peace. We need to be able to see each other as the same, as equals. And I want to suggest a pretty radical challenge to that, and another potential, a way of seeing it. And I'm going to bring maybe another example after this of a different way of looking at it. I want to say here is perhaps it is that the Jewish people really believe that they're the chosen people. Not in a way that makes space for other people, but really believe it until the end. And perhaps Muslim people believe that in Islam, they really are the chosen people. That Muhammad's revelation to them has in a sense superseded previous religions. And in that way, and if that might be the case for some people, then the chance of a classic liberal vision of peace could never work, because I think the sense of equality between us is something that's such a critical base of we see each other, that equality between humanity. But what if between those kind of those exclusive identities, we could seek not equality but respect between them, and a different kind of basis that we're using for our peace building. And this night, I just want to put an example, something to explore. I want to bring another example of another way how something that I learned from Rabbi Fruman taught us. He said it could be that in Islam, he says, I'll say this myself, as a Jew, I know that I can't eat pig. It's just forbidden to me. There's some things I can't do. It's true of a life-surviving things I can, but in general, I can't eat pig. It's just a restriction that I live with. He says, when he looked at Hamas's idea, the ideology of Hamas, it could be that Hamas is forbidden from giving up on the land of Palestine. It's forbidden to sign a treaty with Israel to recognize a secular state that's come in and taken this holy land and is seeking to create a non-Muslim entity. Maybe that's just a source, just prohibited. So Rabbi Fruman said maybe this is part of why Hamas will not accept the peace treaty, almost stood against the Oslo Accords. And he says, but as he started to learn Islam, he realized that there's an idea in Islam that allows you to make a ceasefire, not a peace, not an end-all peace agreement, but a ceasefire with an entity that's more powerful than you. And he says one of Israel's prime points that they sought for in the peace negotiations was a negotiation that would end the conflict by signing this agreement. The Oslo Accords were going to end the conflict and any further claim on this land for each other. It's going to be an end to the conflict. That's what Israel sought, because we wanted to end the conflict. But what if Hamas just religiously can't do that? So Rav Fruman suggested, what if we phrase the peace process as we're seeking a 100-year ceasefire in respect for Islam? He says, maybe that's something that Hamas could sign to. It's true, we won't get the end-all, be-all of peace, but we'll achieve a 100-year ceasefire. And who knows what will happen in those 100 years. And that for me is a space of what it, let's go back to this theme about what does it mean to make peace building within those national identities, to use those existing tropes, sometimes maybe recognize the futility of trying to come against them and instead find the ways within them to engage. Those are kind of some of the the things we think about here, and in understanding how do we bring these parts of both Israeli and Palestinian society who are not engaged in the peace process in, and recognizing that by speaking to their identity is one of the prime things that they need to feel in order to even, in a sense, come into the room. Then if let's open up people, if people want to, I don't know, David, the best way to run chat.
So thank you both to Noor and to Shaul for your presentation. If people have questions, please put them in the chat to me. Some questions have come in already to me, so I'll start with them in the order that I have received them. So how do we both teach Jewish history and build Jewish identity, as both of you talked about the importance of identity, while also building an understanding and real empathy towards others with competing identities? Where is the balance point?
Yeah, I think around 9th grade. I don't know if I told this story the last time we were here. We have a summer camp. It's a joint summer camp for Israeli and Palestinian kids, and there's a game. All the Israeli youth movements people like to play, For Whom the Wind Blows. Right, and you stand in a circle with all the kids, and the person in the middle has to shout out a category. The wind blows for all those who have annoying little brothers. And all the people in the circle of annoying little brothers have to go find a new seat. And they're playing the game, whoever's wearing red, And then one of my neighbor's kids stood in the middle of the circle and said, the wind blows for all those who live in Israel. And none of the Palestinian kids moved. And she couldn't figure that out. And she looked at her counselor. She said, Susu, wow. Why didn't you move? You live in Israel. And she looked at her and she says, I don't live in Israel. I live in Palestine. And the look of confusion on this third grader's face, who suggested that she lives in Israel, was priceless and confusing and challenging and bewildering. And eventually they came to terms in the game that Palestine's also in Israel. And therefore, I don't know exactly what they decided. We moved on. But I bring this story to ask that question of when is the time when you're teaching your children their values and their identity? When does become the time to really challenge that? Now, in our young adults program at Roots, which we're meeting tonight, those are 16 to 18-year-olds. And by there, at a certain point in a kid's growing up, those, who those people are and what their flag means or what they're doing here, somehow must show up. And generally in the conflict, it shows up as enemy. Those are the people who are out there to deny our story. They're full of lies. And somewhere in that branch between 4th grade and little kids and say 9th or 10th grade is a space where it becomes, I think, critical to start asking that question. But it's not a simple question. And one of the things that has been going on in Israel actually in the last 3 weeks. There's been a lot of big stories, but amongst the peace organizations, anyway, there's been several big stories that some of the other peace organizations, like the Bereaved Families Forum. The Bereaved Families Forum is Israelis and Palestinians who have lost family members to the conflict and have chosen to join a joint organization for reconciliation. And one of the things they do is speak in Israeli high schools. And there's been protests and there's been outrage by parents saying, don't bring in these enemies to confuse our kids. Or why are you bringing people who supported violence against us to come and brainwash our kids? And kind of very right-wing protests. And they've been not, in some schools they've been not able to present. Now at Roots, we do a lot of also work with high schoolers and with college, with kids before they go to the army. And for some reason we don't get that. And part of the reason is because at the beginning of the talk, they'll hear me speaking passionately about my identity and what this land means to me, and what it means to be here as a Jew, as in all the things I can beautifully wax poetically about living in Judea and Samaria, et cetera, and why that's so powerful for me. But what I want to say here is that there's something in the way to do that. We need some way where their own identity feels recognized and secure, and how that can possibly not be threatened by engaging the other side's identity. So I don't have the answer. I mean, it's a really important question that I think as especially as Jewish educators abroad, when is the time to bring in those other people's claims? I think there's definitely something there about about people's human maturity, and I think there's something when we're growing up, things are very black and white. There's truth and there's falseness. As we get older and exposed to multiple views, and we realize that, well, there's different perspectives on the same thing. So it's somewhere in that same kind of level of age of development where kids can start getting that complexity, that I think it becomes a time to really go there. The other side, I'd say, but the other element going on, teaching it here in Israel, Palestine, is, I don't say as opposed to, but what may be less of a challenge is, like when Noor talked about his identity growing up, that was identity that was full of living the occupation, it was full of encounters with Israeli soldiers and violence from the other side, and vice versa here also for the Israeli kids here. There's a space where they're growing up with identity is constantly being attacked by the other side. So it's not a theoretical. It really takes a level of education that it's not just saying there's two sides to it, but I think in the end of the day here, an Israeli kid needs to see a Palestinian who can recognize their side, who's not a threat to them, who's presenting their identity, but says, in my Palestinianness, want to live with Israelis and vice versa. I think that's something really critical in how we get to phrasing that the voice comes, that the recognition comes to the other side, and then the other side can be presented. And I can see it as but it definitely is a place of mature. It's a mature, Noor, do you have anything to think about? Share about thoughts about when you go there?
For me, it was like not that early, I would say. Education is important, and at a young age, at school, we studied about like many things. We studied about the Holocaust. We studied about the history. And what I'm trying to say here, I mean that to learn about the other side, about their identity, and empathize with, in this case, in the case of a conflict, in a case of contradiction, it's not that easy, and it wasn't possible until I was able to see that there is someone on the other side sympathizes with me, so that I can sympathize with their story. That's what I feel like. I think that education is one thing. Like, I got education at a certain age, but it didn't really change my mind about the other side. But what's more important than education is like meeting the other side and seeing them as human beings. That's the important step that allowed me to open my mind and start to learn more and accept.
When listening to Noor and thinking back on the question, also, I think so many people here, their first encounter with the other side is in the space of conflict. The first time they're hearing Palestine is being said against the Jews. The first time they're hearing about Israel, they've been seeing this posed against. And it'd really be interesting to think about a group of kids who grew up with that complexity, who grew up with that sense of not denying each other's side, and how that can be. I will say at Roots Programming, we do run programs like our summer camp and things like that, and after school programs for younger kids. And I'd say it's mostly focused on maybe the cultural, on the language, learning each other's language, learning to feel comfortable in each other's space. Then in the high school kids is when they start getting to more like the national narratives, and kind of going into that. Engaging with the other side's national narrative. But before then, I think there's also a world of work which is also largely not being done in this land. That's just feeling comfortable with Arabic, feeling comfortable with Hebrew, feeling comfortable being by somebody from the other side. So I think that's the place where and letting kids play. And I know with my kids, like they know that they have Palestinian kids that they played with. They know that I work with Palestinians. They know there's Arabs who are their friends, and they know that there's other people who are bad people, but they're not this. But there's good people too. So I think that's already enough of at least at this stage in the game, enough of a bar to strive for giving those positive counters to the negative stereotypes that are out there.
Thank you. So the next question that came to me, how are your presentations perceived or received, I guess, by outside interested parties versus stakeholders within the land?
Can you say it again? Can you say it one more time, David?
Yeah. How are your presentations and your work, how is it received by people inside the land versus outside the land? Is there a difference?
Yeah, there's I'd say the biggest difference is just it expresses itself in different ways, but the biggest difference is the emotional aspect, the trauma aspect of it. When I'm speaking to an Israeli group, who lives in the South, how many seconds do you have to get to a bomb shelter? And people say 7 seconds, 15 seconds, 30 seconds, 50 seconds. That's a level of what this conflict means to them. That's much more prescient than any book that they read or news item. Palestinians, how many times have Israeli soldiers come to your town who has a relative in prison who's themselves been beaten or taken by Israeli soldiers? That's I think the main is the level of personal trauma experienced by the conflict is really what's below the things when you speak to people who live here, the Israeli audiences. Like I'll say an example, a right-wing a group, an Israeli, like a Jewish group from abroad that has right-wing views. It's very well worked out, and there's like the truth is very true, but it's different than it's sometimes even harder to crack. I think when it's the emotional experience and there's a Palestinian speaker speaking to their pain, something cuts across in a very real way. Whereas otherwise it can go into like an intellectual argument about, are the Palestinians really a people? That happens, I think, more with kind of ideological groups from abroad than it does on people on the ground. But I say that's the main difference, the visceral sense of the conflict means here.
Okay, thank you.
Noor, do you want to reflect on that? Like the difference between groups from abroad, groups of Israelis or Palestinians?
I feel that people who are here are more emotionally affected by the conflict. It's very close to them. That's what I feel. Like sometimes it's easier to talk to groups from outside who are like more would like look rationally at things, and they are not so affected by the emotional side of it.
I'd say honestly, like after we've been doing a lot of these talks with Israeli pre-military academies recently, like Israelis before they go to the military, and you see people in tears after hearing a Palestinian speaker. You hear people like processing their own fears, their own limits. It's very real for them. That's I think that's something that's very powerful here. Yeah.
Okay. Next question for Shaul.
Yeah.
How do you feel about the United Nations perspective on the legality of the West Bank and East Jerusalem settlements? That the United Nations seems to have called them illegal.
Right. That there's a discourse in international law that the settlements are illegal. I feel there's a very flippant answer I can give to there's a flippant sense of that the question of Jewish survival which is really the impetus for the settlements in the beginning of the day, not today, but like where it came from. That I always say the settlements are an example of the conflict. They're part of their original justification as a defensive line between Israel and Palestine, or between Israel and the Arab world. You know, I lived in Tekoa since it's a front line against a future Jordanian invasion, which is how the settlements started post 67 and really post 73. And then as the conflict grew and the Oslo Peace Accords came about, that there was the attempt to create a peace and a lasting peace between those sides, and that sense of defensive lines was supposed to become irrelevant. So today that seems absurd. We have a peace treaty with Jordan, we have a peace treaty with Egypt. You don't need settlements in Gaza. You don't need settlements on the eastern line of Jerusalem anymore. And that was led into the Oslo Accords in the attempt to take away the settlements. But then came the bus bombs of the 90s and the bus bombs of the 2000s. And for me, at least, when I moved to Israel in 2000, and the bombs were going off in Haifa and Afula and Netanya and Tel Aviv. And it became clear to me that the claim against the Jews in this land is not about the Jews in the West Bank. It's about Jews, about Israel. It's about Israel's existence. It's about what's going to be here. And then got into that line of feeling, at least. But then on a deeper level, getting away from kind of just that kind of violence and reaction and war. For me, I don't think that Jews living in the hills of Judea should be a problem to a peace element. I think when there's a peace between Israel and Palestine, we hope Palestine is going to be a democratic state. And the proof of a healthy democracy, right, is as a minority that's able to live there with guaranteed rights and be a part of that society. And so if we have to remove the Jews from Judea to make peace, for me that always made a sense of what kind of peace is this? Today 20% of Israel's citizens are Palestinian, they're Arab Israelis or Palestinians, and there will be the same in some way on the other side. It's going to have to go through kind of process. There's going to be a lot of things that have to change on that route. But the idea that the international discourse about the illegality, which goes into the questions of was it a defensive war and this, and sometimes that international discourse just feels far away from what actually the conflict looks like on the ground. And especially less so when I live now, but when I lived much of Gush Etzion, for instance, was always supposed to be part of the territorial land swaps. Meaning under the Oslo Accord, Gush Etzion would have been annexed formally to Israel in exchange for territorial swaps to Palestine. And the truth is, I think of a good amount of the settlements are actually in those areas. So on that technical level there, but I think on a deeper level, I want to say is I don't think a solution which keeps both sides away from their homeland is really the right solution. I think we need to look for a solution that allows both peoples to live on both sides of the Green Line. Some kind of confederation between these two, between an Israeli and Palestinian state, would be maybe an ideal way of doing that. The illegality, I just want to go back to the question of that legal argument feels far away from the context of where the conflict's taking place. And I think that work, and here this is definitely, okay, this is the privilege of the Israeli side. I know the Palestinian cause looks to international law to bring a case of bringing power to the Palestinian claim. But at this point, I think the settlements that are not built on private Palestinian land, we need to find some way to build some kind of reconciliation process. There need to be some kind of a parallel rebuilding of Palestinian villages that were destroyed in 48 within Israel proper, as some kind of way of moving forward and letting both peoples live in their homeland. So just to connect it to the last minute, it's not about some kind of spiritual feeling high of like some spiritual privilege of being here. It's from the space of we've been in a conflict which demanded very real ways of defending ourselves, and we want to move from that conflict into a way where there is a reconciliation between these two identities, and the sense of common homeland can be recognized by both sides. And when that's done, whether through a liberal model or through some of the things we were talking about here about a more nationalist-based model, at the end of the day, I'm not, whatever works is going to work. But I do want to say, I think the liberal model has failed at engaging large swaths of both Palestinian and Israeli society, and that needs to be recognized and readdressed in some way. But by doing that, it's about allowing some kind of sense of homeland, of common homeland being shared by both peoples.
Great, thank you. Okay, so next question that came in to me is about there's a book, The Storyteller of Jerusalem, which talks about the experience of Arabs and Jews during the Ottoman Empire and the sharing of cultures during that time between Christians and Muslim Arabs and Jews. And so the question that is being posed is, what are some ways that we can get back to that time of sharing between cultures from the silos that we're in today? And that question seems to be for both of you.
Political rights, equal political rights is what would allow those kind of cultural exchanges to blossom again. Today, there's not equal political rights. I did a short answer. That was great. But I mean, but I think, yeah, in order for this, I think a lot of what's holding back the cultural exchange on ways, because there's still a national legal struggle, and a struggle for legal rights, equal legal rights, that holds back a lot of those kinds of relations that could someday come back.
Great. The next question for both of you is about the idea of Israel as being an apartheid state, and how you would, whether you feel that this is true, and how you would respond to this this claim for both of you.
No, you want to go first? I'll go.
Yeah, sure. So for this question, I would say, I think today people have this discussion about apartheid, and it seems to me like that people are trying to use the terminology to describe the situation, but like they are not really talking about the situation itself in a way. Like, the bigger the terminology, or like how bad it sounds, is like that's what people like think that it will affect or change the reality. When I mean, so the claim of that there's apartheid here basically comes from the fact that, you know, after more than 50 years of the occupation, and Israel is a Jewish state, there is no equality between the Jews and the non-Jews here in Israel. And it's true that, yes, Israel is a Jewish state, and there will not be an equality between the Jew and the non-Jew. But when people talk about the West Bank, I don't see that this is the situation, and that's why it's like it's confusing for some people, because the actions are being done by Israel in the West Bank are always justified against Palestinians for security. And it happens in a context of a conflict, and it's a very violent conflict. So here I would prefer to still use the term occupation, because we are under Israel's military rule, and Israel does not recognize us as its citizens at all. Israel does not claim that Palestinians in the West Bank they are citizens. Israel officially only claims East Jerusalem to be part of it. So policies of apartheid I would say, I'm not a legal expert, but I would say it would be more applicable in East Jerusalem and even inside Israel proper itself, where Palestinians there are citizens. And then the question of equality and discrimination between Jews and Arabs, that's a question about Israel itself, but not about the West Bank or Gaza. And even in East Jerusalem, even if Israel has a claim, or Israel does claim East Jerusalem to be part of it, still the international community, the international society sees the East Jerusalem as part of the occupied territories and as part of the West Bank. And therefore Israeli actions there are illegal. So that's how I think about it. Now The last thing I want to add, because of where I am and the process I went through and how do I see things, I see that the Israelis succeeded to create their own state, their own self-determination, or something that Shaul actually talked about. The first Zionists actually succeeded. They actually gave birth to a Jewish state. Now, today, the reality is different. The Jews today are not in a vulnerable situation as they used to be. They are not in the danger that they used to be in. Maybe some people think that they are, but they are in a better situation than they used to be. They are not in a surviving mode. So, yeah, the way how Israel it is, and the way how Israel was built as a Jewish state, will end up leading to a situation that can be described as an apartheid, I think. But that's being confused with the situation in the occupied territories in the West Bank. I hope that was a clear answer.
Yeah, thank you. Shaul?
So obviously a lot of ink being spilt about since the Amnesty International report, right, calling Israel an apartheid state, like across really, and it's across the whole area. I'll say I want to say as a pre-answer to the answer, what's going on today now is horrible. Palestinian life being controlled by the Israeli military. I think in a military regime or a military occupation of a Palestinian life is something that's here. It needs to end. And the question is how to end it, right? Palestinians deserve equality. They deserve their self-determination. They deserve the right to determine their destiny, and Israelis too. The question is how do we get there from where we are right now? So I can think is apartheid a useful thing in that quest? Is calling the system apartheid is useful? I think if you have the conviction that the only thing that's going to change this conflict is pressure against Israel, then you're gonna whatever sets off the alarm bells around the world to say, look, what Israel's doing is apartheid. So that's good. If you feel that there's change potential within Israel, if you believe that there's a potential for partnership within Israel, then I think you'd say tactically apartheid. Maybe you also say it's a warning bell. You can shout, that's a word. Israeli politicians have said we're slipping towards apartheid. I think people have said. For me, I think, and here's a question: does the context in which apartheid developed is apartheid? What is apartheid? Is it policies or is it a system? Does the racial element of South Africa have a part of what apartheid was? There's not different water stations in Israel for people of different races. There's definitely prejudice, but I think the main thing to point out is that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is a nationalist struggle over it's been a war. As far as I know, I'm not an expert in South African history, but I don't think there's a war, but there wasn't a war between the whites and the blacks. That then the whites won and imposed this whole thing. There was the whites inherited colonial rule from the English, the Boers, and the Afrikaner government made the system control, and there was a fear there of a war, maybe a fear there of an uprising. But I think the way that how Israel, Palestine, and what today are the security apparatus and the security measures that are, let's say, in the West Bank about what people call apartheid, came out of very real wars after really real violence, and I think that's a difference. Is that a difference? I think it is a difference, because I also think the way out of this, as opposed to dismantling an apartheid regime, which is the case of what people want to do in South Africa, and extend the equal vote for everybody, I don't think the way out of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is the same thing. I think the level of reconciliation between the two identities is something that's a part of this. I think building trust. I think putting an end to extremist violence is a big part of dismantling this. I think empowering the moderate voices on both camps to get back and to give them voting capital and power to restart a peace process is a real process of it. Yes, I think the conflict has engendered tremendous amounts of injustice, and there's plenty of discrimination, and there's fear, and there's hate, and there's all those elements here. But I think the context, like in instance of Noor says, I think there is a danger in applying terms from one conflict zone to another zone that sometimes, and they from by doing that, we miss out on what's actually needs to happen in this conflict zone. Because I think if you say apartheid, then it's clear we need to boycott the Israeli regime and pull pressure upon them and isolate them until what dismantled apartheid in South Africa. And I'm not sure that's the best. I'm not sure that's the best way. I think as an Israeli committed to peace and to go into working for peace within our society, I think there's a lot of other things we're going to miss out on doing by doing that, and I'm not sure it's going to bring about to peace. I'm not sure where it's going to lead. The question that Bob wrote about equal political rights, that Israel loses its national identity because of right. I spoke, and I believe we need equal rights. I'm not sure we need them as part of one state, though. Personally, I think when we get into that questioning of where would be a political model for us to live through, I think the confederation models. Like Land for All is an Israeli-Palestinian political initiative for a confederation, which would address a lot of these core issues. And it's also, what's interesting, it's also a joint initiative, I think, born out of the same kind of analysis of grappling with these nationalist kind of themes we've been talking about, their national stories or legitimacies or questions about connection to land, about Palestinian refugees, about Israeli settlers. And they suggest a confederation of two states, where I would live in Tekoa as a citizen of Israel, but a resident of Palestine. Noor could be a citizen of Palestine, and he could actually live anywhere in this country, anywhere in this entire land, because he wouldn't be a demographic threat to the Israeli national, or the Jewish national home, or me a threat to the Palestinian national home. So that's one way of see, I can put a link to kind of their political initiative. I think it's worth actually invite them to come and speak. Actually, they do also they're also doing very important work, more on the political level. I think Roots' work is more on the civil society and education and local leadership. But they're working on the political level of kind of a new political paradigm that I think applies some of the lessons we've been talking about, drawing here today.
Okay, well, thank you again to both of you. I think those are all the questions that I've received. I'm grateful for your time. Thank you to everybody who came. And if you enjoy learning, you're all invited to come to a class tomorrow evening about Adon Olam, which is a prayer that we do regularly, but don't always think about. So if you're available at 8 o'clock, you're invited to join. And if you're interested but can't make it, please send me an email, dschwartz@wsthc.org, and I can get you the source sheet. And I hope that you all have a wonderful day full of peace and coexistence.